Coronavirus pandemic presents us with one of the biggest challenges we have faced as a country in decades. Our message to the British public is clear: please stay at home to protect the NHS and to save lives. And as a government, we continue to take the right measures at the right time, guided by the science and the medical experts. I want to pay tribute to the enormous contribution that our NHS and other frontline workers have made to tackling this virus. We owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, and we will continue to do whatever it takes to support them. Our aim has always been, Mr. Speaker, to protect the NHS and to save lives, and with the public's incredible support, we are doing that by flattening the peak of this virus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for all of your efforts to ensure Parliament can meet and apply the scrutiny to government that we expect and we embrace. This House meets in challenging times. Together we can and we will defeat this virus.
Can I echo the sentiments about the Prime Minister? We do wish him a speedy recovery. And it does allow me to tell the House that the Honourable Member for Rother Valley has withdrawn, so I will be calling Sir Keir Starmer and welcoming him in his first outing to this dispatch box. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you, the House authorities and the staff for allowing us to meet in this way today, because it's important that we have this scrutiny. Can I also send all of our best wishes through the First Secretary to the Prime Minister for a full and speedy recovery. And I'm sure I speak for the whole House in sending our best wishes to all of those affected by coronavirus, and condolences of the whole House to all of those that have lost loved ones. And again, for the whole House, our deepest thanks to those on the front line risking their lives to keep us safe and our country going. Mr. Speaker, I promised that we would give constructive opposition with the courage to support the government where that's the right thing to do. And we all want and need the government to succeed in defeating coronavirus. But we also have to have the courage to challenge where we think the government is getting it wrong. And in that spirit, I want to start with testing. Testing is obviously crucial at every stage of the pandemic. But we have been very slow, and we're way behind other European countries. Now, the Health Secretary made a very important commitment to 100,000 tests a day by the end of April. But yesterday, the figure for actual tests was 18,000 a day, and that was down from Monday, which was 19,000 tests a day. So we're way behind the curve, and the end of the month is a week tomorrow. So what does the First Secretary expect to happen in the next 8 days to get us from 18,000 tests a day to 100,000 tests a day?
First Secretary.
The right honourable gentleman, congratulate him on his success being elected leader of the Labour Party. I will certainly pass on his best wishes to the Prime Minister. I know he would want to be here in person. And can I join him in paying tribute to all of our NHS and other frontline workers? He rightly raises the crucial issue of testing, which is going to be an incredibly important part of our strategy for transitioning from the current social distancing measures. But I do have to just correct him. Our capacity for tests is now at 40,000 per day. So I think that is an incredibly important milestone. And of course, he's right to say that in the final week, that will require a big increase. But of course, with a project like this, it does require an exponential increase in the final days and the final week of the programme. I can reassure him that we are working with a range of commercial partners to boost the testing to get to that 100,000 tests per day. 2 of our super labs in Milton Keynes and Alderley Park are now fully functional, and Glasgow will be open later this week.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you very much to the First Secretary, and thank you for his kind comments. I didn't need correcting because I gave the figure for the actual tests a day. The First Secretary says that there's capacity for 40,000 tests a day, and I think it's really important that we fully understand what the First Secretary just said, because that means that the day before yesterday, 40,000 tests could have been carried out, but only 18,000 tests were actually carried out. Now, all week, I've heard from the front line, from care workers who are frankly desperate for tests for their residents and for themselves, desperate. They would expect every test to be used every day for those that need them. So there's clearly a problem. Why isn't the government using all the tests available every day?
Well, Secretary.
I thank the right honourable gentleman, and it's important to pay tribute because there are two elements of this. Getting the capacity up is part of it, and we're making good progress, and I hope that he has conceded that point. The issue of then increasing the demand is something that we've got control over. Of course, we're making sure that the eligibility is broadened. Our focus, as I think you would agree, should be on frontline NHS staff, broadened out to care workers and other key workers, and then done in a way which the system can manage. We are confident that based on our test capacity that we will be able to deliver that, and we have in relation to the capacity itself and getting to the 100,000 target, a range of deals with Thermo Fisher, with Randox. We've got the AstraZeneca, GSK and Cambridge University working together to set up a new lab that we will deliver, and those tests will be crucial, not just in terms of controlling the virus, but allowing the country to move to the next phase.
Kirsten.
I'm grateful, and I welcome the fact that capacity has gone up. But it's not now a question of driving up demand. Demand is there. Last week, the Health Secretary said that every care worker who needed a test would get one. But the reality on the ground is very different, and there are very few tests indeed. And the position is this: if a care worker has symptoms of coronavirus, or a family member has symptoms, he or she has to self-isolate, quite rightly. To get a necessary test, they're then instructed to travel to a testing centre, which is often very many miles away. So an example is social care workers in Leicester are being told to go to the outskirts of Nottingham, a 45-minute drive, in order to get tested. There are lots of examples across the country of this. Now, there's an obvious problem with that system. Not all care workers will have access to a car. Because they've got symptoms or family members have got symptoms, they obviously can't use public transport, so it's little wonder we're seeing these pictures of half-empty testing centres. Yep. So it doesn't look like that's a good plan. And it's not about driving up demand, it's about tests where they're needed. So what reassurance can the First Secretary give to care workers on the front line that things will improve for them and fast?
Secretary.
Honourable gentleman, it is certainly about capacity. I've addressed that in my earlier answers, and also explained how we'll bridge the 100,000. It is about demand. We need to encourage those who are able to take the test to come forward. But he is right. He is right to say it's also about distribution and some of the logistical and, frankly, transport challenges that people, particularly some of those that he described, will have in terms of getting to the test. So we're working with the local resilience forums to make sure that we can distribute the tests as effectively as possible. We've got mobile labs to go to some of those areas for the hard to reach. We'll be using the Army, who have made, along with the other key workers, an incredible contribution to support that effort. But I just come back to the key point. I do think it's important to have a target and to drive towards a target. We are making good progress. We're confident we'll meet it. And I think that he should join with me as we engage in this national effort of saying to Labour's Welsh Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, who has abandoned the Welsh target in Labour-run Wales of 5,000, that actually we need to work together in all four corners of the United Kingdom to make sure that we reach that national effort. It is about capacity, it is about distribution. We'll only be able to manage to hit that target if all of us come together to deliver on it.
Kirsten.
Mr. Speaker, I do recognise how hard people are working to try to drive the number of tests up, but there is a significant gap and there's only 8 days left. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, Manjit Singh Riat, an A&E consultant at the Royal Derby Hospital, sadly died of coronavirus. He, I think, was the first Sikh A&E consultant respected widely across the country and instrumental in building up Derbyshire's emergency services. He's sadly just one of the many frontline health and social care workers to have died from coronavirus during this crisis. So can the First Secretary tell us how many NHS workers have now died from coronavirus and how many social care workers have now died from coronavirus.
First Secretary.
Well, can I just say to him that I entirely agree with the broader point he makes, which is that as our key workers, whether they're in the NHS, whether they're in social care, who are fighting for us, tending for the most vulnerable in our society, need the full support. That's why it's so important that we ramp up the testing, ramp up the PPE deliveries. On the latest figures, my understanding is that 69 people have died within the NHS of coronavirus. I don't have the precise figure for care homes. They're more difficult to establish in relation to care home workers as opposed to care home residents. But I think we can all agree in this House, every one of those is a tragedy, and that can only double down our efforts to tackle this virus and do everything we can to support those amazing workers in the NHS who are delivering so much to take the battle to the coronavirus.
Keir Starmer.
I thank the First Secretary for giving us the figure in relation to NHS workers, and of course a tragic case, each and every one of them. I'm disappointed we don't have a number for social care workers, and I've put the First Secretary on notice that I'll ask the same question again next week, and hopefully we can have a better answer. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to protective equipment. Clearly this is crucial to those at risk on the front line, who are risking their lives to save ours, and the least they deserve is the right protective equipment. And we've all heard countless examples of frontline workers not getting the equipment they need. This is an example from a Unison care worker just last weekend, and I quote, "I work in a nursing home. I'm terrified. I don't know if residents have a virus. We're wearing homemade masks. This is horrible, and I'm very scared." And that word scared, I think, is one we've all heard many, many times in this last 2 or 3 weeks. A survey by the Royal College of Nursing found that half of nursing staff felt under pressure to work without the levels of protective equipment set out in official guidance. This has been a stress test of our resilience, and the government plan is clearly not working. So can I ask the First Secretary to tell frontline workers at risk, when will they finally get the equipment they need to keep them safe?
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first say that in relation to all of those frontline staff who have passed away as they battle coronavirus and work so hard to protect other people who are suffering, our hearts go out to them, and he's absolutely right that we must do everything we can to protect them. I know we recently had a consultant who passed away at Kingston Hospital, where I've been treated, where both my boys were born and delivered. How important that is, how personal it is to so many of us, and we absolutely agree on the need to protect them. He will know that getting the PPE to where it needs to be is a massive international challenge that every country faces globally, from China to Germany. And we've done a huge effort to provide, for example, the ventilators, which have bolstered the NHS during this incredibly difficult time. If we hadn't been able to do that, the NHS would not have been able to cope. Since the start of the outbreak, we've delivered 1 billion items of personal protective equipment, and tens of millions have been distributed via the devolved administrations. We recognise, though, that we've got to strive even harder in this incredibly difficult and competitive international environment to source the equipment. That's why we brought in my noble friend Lord Dayton, formerly Chief Executive of the London 2012 Olympics, who's been appointed to lead on our domestic efforts. We've delivered 34 million items of PPE across 38 local resilience forums. We've established the hotlines, the Royal Mail procedures, a new pilot website to make sure not only have we got the amount of PPE that we need to, but also that it can get to the most vulnerable and those on the front line who need it most.
Keir Starmer.
Can I join the sentiments of the First Secretary in relation to all of those working on the front line, and also pay tribute to all of those that have ramped up the capacity of the NHS. It's been incredible to see what's happened in the last few weeks, and I know that's been a huge effort. I do understand the challenge of getting the right equipment to the right place every time, but as the First Secretary knows, there's a significant gap between promise and delivery. And over the last few days, it's emerged that British manufacturers have got in touch with many members of the opposition, probably members across the House, saying that they offered to help produce protective equipment, but they didn't get a response from the government. Now, I do understand due diligence and that all the offers couldn't be taken up, but some of those who offered to help are now supplying to other countries. So they clearly could have supplied in this country. and something's going wrong. And there's a pattern emerging here. We were slow into lockdown, slow on testing, slow on protective equipment, and now slow to take up these offers from British firms. The Prime Minister has said this is a national effort, and he's right about that. So in that spirit, can I ask the First Minister to commit to working with the opposition to identify and take up these offers from British manufacturers for protective equipment just as soon as possible?
First Secretary.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman. Although I don't accept his premise that we've been slow, we have been guided by the scientific advice, the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer at every step along this way. If he thinks he knows better than they do, with the benefit of hindsight, then that's his decision. But that is not the way we've proceeded, and it's not the way we will in the future. He's mentioned offers from British businesses, and it's not quite right to say that they must have been acceptable for UK standards just because they're supplying different needs in different countries abroad. But what I can reassure him on this, 8,000 businesses have offered PPE in response to the government's call, and every business receives a response. 3,000 of those 8,000 are followed up where they've got either the specification or the volume that makes it a sensible thing for the NHS to do. And he did make, I think, a sensible point about specifications and health standards. He will know from the reporting that in other countries that have distributed PPE without those high standards, they've been distributed with faults or flaws, they've had to be recalled, and health workers in those countries have had to go in isolation. So I appreciate that he wants to put pressure and scrutinise the government, but I think, and I hope he'll understand, the need to take the right decisions and to scrutinise very carefully the precious PPE that we're putting on the front line to protect our key workers.
David Mundell, we've been unable to connect, so I now go to Ian Blackford with his first of his two questions. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, we are reminded every day of the terrible toll that it takes on our society, but also of the heroic efforts by our frontline workers, and I would like to take the opportunity to put on record our gratitude for everything that they do. Mr. Speaker, it is now 34 days since the Chancellor first announced a package of economic support, at the time heralded as a package of support for all businesses and workers during this health emergency. And yet, 34 days on, thousands of businesses and individuals have found themselves with no income, with no support, and no end in sight, and all because of arbitrary cut-off dates and bureaucratic barriers imposed by this UK government. People are being left behind. Today, the Scottish National Party is leading a cross-party call for a universal basic income to finally protect everyone. It will put cash in people's pockets, and it will help ensure a strong economic recovery and a fairer society. Can the First Secretary of State give us a straight answer today? Does he support this proposal, or does he reject it?
First Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, can I pay tribute, along with the Honourable Gentleman, to the key workers that have served every one of our four nations. Can I also say, in relation to Scotland, that we recognise the UK-wide effort to tackle coronavirus, the RAF helicopters helping Scottish patients get treatment, the Regiment of Scotland setting up test centres in Glasgow, and the 11 million items of personal protective equipment that have been delivered from central UK government stocks to make sure that as one United Kingdom we defeat the coronavirus. I don't agree with his point on the universal income. The Chancellor has, I think quite rightly, adopted and announced a series of measures, second to none in the world, to support workers through the job retention scheme, to make sure that for those that don't qualify, other support like an increase in universal credit and working tax credits are able to deal with the challenge. And I think we need to have a very focused approach, providing the resources that we need to those that need it most. And a universal income without being based on need wouldn't provide that.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the simple fact is that many people are being left behind. Many people are not getting an income just now. A universal basic income is the right economic policy at the right time. Mr. Speaker, its time has come. Over 100 members of Parliament from 7 political parties, parties from across the 4 nations and regions of the United Kingdom, have come together to support the solution. Polling shows that 84% of the public now support this. A universal basic income is a solution that will provide support for anybody, and crucially, it will leave no one behind. First Secretary of State, it's a solution that deserves more than the answer that we got just now. The government should think again, because we shouldn't be left in the situation that either the self-employed or those that are seasonal workers and others don't get the support they deserve. Will the government think on this again and do the right thing? Make sure that no one is left behind. Yes or no?
First Secretary.
I thank the right honourable gentleman, but as I made clear in my earlier answer, we want to make sure we provide the support to those who need it most. A universal approach, uniform without reference to need or income or the most vulnerable in our society, is not the way I respectfully suggest to achieve it. Our plan is one of the most extensive in the world. It makes sure that workers receive 80% of their salary, up to £2,500. We've already extended this to June. We have made other forms of support available for those that don't qualify. He's talked about the self-employed or others who may not fall within the criteria of the scheme. I've made clear the increases to universal credit and the working tax credit basic rate, the mortgage holidays, the energy bill deferrals. That's the way we have a focused approach that is targeting the resources at those who need them most and allows our economy as a whole to pull through this coronavirus.
We're now going over to Peterborough.
Mr. Speaker, at this time of national emergency, many people are being forced to use their bank overdrafts. Yet the banks are charging 20% interest per year, which they're going to increase to 40% in July. At the same time, they're offering savers a pathetic interest rate of 0.1%. Yet these are the same banks that was saved by billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. What on earth is going on? When are the banks going to act in the national interest? Acting Prime Minister.
Off in his prime. I think the First Secretary can get the best out of that. We'll all benefit. First Secretary.
I thank my honourable friend. I'm pretty sure I got the gist, and he's right to refer to the support banks need to be providing to customers. And thanks to the work of the Chancellor, the major banks and building societies have provided relief to those impacted by coronavirus, including deferring mortgage and other loan repayments, including increasing overdraft limits, including increasing credit card limits. By the first week of April, 1.2 million mortgage payment holidays had been granted, and in this national effort, as we pay tribute to those across the country who are stepping up to the plate, we certainly expect the banks to do their bit.
We're now going over to Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Like Sam's Chop House, the Frog and Bucket, and hundreds more in Manchester, nearly 3/4 of hospitality businesses don't qualify for grants, and for most, loans just aren't an option. Given that the hospitality and retail sector are the lifeblood of our high streets and are likely to face the longest government-enforced closure, will he extend cash grants and come up with a rescue package to stop thousands of pubs, restaurants, shops and venues from disappearing altogether?
First Secretary.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady, and I certainly agree with her about the challenge we've got across all the sectors she mentioned in making sure that we see them through this incredibly difficult period. We want to make sure that the country, the economy, all those small businesses, all those sectors she mentioned can bounce back. The Chancellor has introduced a whole range of measures in relation to both finance, grants where they're capable of being made, and also other tax deferrals to enable small business and those in the sectors she described. I will, of course, certainly if there are any particular businesses, take them away and look at them very carefully and make sure that the Chancellor can assess whether there's any more we can do. But we've got to make sure, from the high street to those sectors which are adding huge value to the economy, that we're in a position after the coronavirus ebbs, and once we come through the initial crisis, to bounce back. And we'll do that by looking after all of those small businesses and all of those sectors that she rightly described.
We're now going over to Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann Hart.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beautiful Hastings and Rye is heavily dependent on tourism as a major driver in the local economy. COVID-19 has badly hit the tourism, leisure and hospitality industries. And has my right honourable friend considered what measures are needed to firstly encourage domestic tourism and secondly ensure that tourism and tourism-related businesses are given the right support to enable recovery from the impact of COVID-19 and revive our local economies?
First Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? She makes a really important point. We know that the coronavirus is significantly affecting the tourist industry. That was a point actually made by the previous honourable lady as well. And the Chancellor has set out unprecedented support for businesses and workers, including those in the tourism sector. That includes business rate support for hospitality and leisure businesses. We've also announced a £1.3 million scheme through Visit England to provide support to destination management organisations at risk of closure because of the coronavirus pandemic, to see them through this difficult time. And we are committed to helping the industry get through this crisis so that we can encourage people to take holidays and to revive the tourism sector as we come through the crisis.
We now go over to Barry Gardner. Barry Gardner.
The Government Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies recommended an urgent lockdown to save lives on the 26th of February, but it took another 3.5 weeks to implement it. The government likes to claim that it has been following the scientific advice, but it hasn't, has it?
First Secretary.
I thank the honourable gentleman. We have at every stage, from January, when the original crisis started to break out in China, right the way through to the moment several weeks ago where we announced our social distancing measures, followed meticulously, carefully and assiduously the advice both from the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer. And as a result of that, and as a result of the measures we've put in place, two things have happened. First of all, we've protected our precious NHS. It hasn't been overwhelmed in the way some had feared. And also, and I pay tribute not just to the key workers, which we've talked about, but the huge sacrifices made by the great British public. Because of their compliance with the social distancing measures, we are starting to come through this peak. And that has only happened because we have taken the right decisions based on the evidence that we've had at the right moment in time. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, that's exactly what we'll continue to do.
We are now going over to Nick Fletcher. Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask what recent steps the government has taken to ensure that the NHS has adequate supplies of personal protective equipment?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? This has been raised already in this House. It's critically important, and I totally agree with him on the imminent need for getting the PPE to the places that need it most. Since the start of the outbreak, we've delivered 1 billion items of personal protective equipment. We've made sure we've distributed it via the devolved administration so that all 4 nations get the equipment they need. We're also working through the local resilience forums with our local authorities and with the support of the military, and making sure, whether it's NHS key workers on the front line or care home workers, that everyone who needs it is getting the PPE they need. And with the help of my noble friend Lord Dayton, who ran the Olympics, we are going to ramp up even further our capacity to not just procure and produce PPE, but get it to where it's needed most.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a time of national crisis, it's critical the government keeps its word. Local councils are ensuring communities get the support they need. I know this from the work that has taken place in Bradford. They are the government on the front line. Will he confirm the government will meet its promise to fund whatever is necessary and fully compensate them for all the cost and loss of income related to the COVID-19 crisis, and not just the funding already announced that only partially covers what the councils have already spent?
First Secretary.
She's absolutely right, and I pay tribute to the councils up and down the country who, whether it's through social care or the services that they need to provide to their residents, are doing an incredible job. And I can reassure the Honourable Lady that we've already announced an additional £1.6 billion of funding just this weekend to support councils delivering those essential services on the front line.
We're now going over to Matt Vickers. Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's commitment to write off £13 billion of debt for hospital trusts across the country, freeing up our hospitals to work through the crisis and creating a firmer foundation for the NHS when we reach the other side. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the government remains committed to record levels of investment in the NHS so that the world's greatest health service can become even better? And would you be willing to look at the case for capital investment in the ageing but amazing award-winning North East Hospital?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? He will know that under this government the NHS will have record funding enshrined in law, the largest hospital building programme in a generation, 50,000 more nurses, 50 million extra GP appointments. In response to the coronavirus, the Chancellor has also launched a £14.5 billion coronavirus emergency response, of which £6.6 billion will go to the NHS. And in relation specifically to North East, we would encourage the Trust to continue to develop their plans and their priorities for local new NHS infrastructure, and we're looking very carefully at all of those.
We're now going over to Stephen Kinnock. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Port Talbot Steelworks is the beating heart of the economy and the community in my Aberavon constituency. And there will be no post-pandemic recovery for our country unless we have a strong and healthy Welsh and British steel industry. The government's coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme is capped at £50 million, which is only 1/10 of what Tata Steel believes will be the cash flow impact on the company over a 6-month period. Will the government now urgently take steps to lift the loan cap to a level that will give our steel industry a fighting chance of surviving this crisis?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? He's right to refer to the business interruption loans. We've made grants of up to 25,000 available for small businesses. I understand the point he makes about the sector in his constituency. We have made changes to the loan scheme, principally to make it quicker to access. 12,000 loans have now been approved, and I know that the Chancellor is looking very carefully at the sector in his constituency, the steel sector, and all of those who are not directly benefiting from this particular scheme, to make sure that in the round we're providing the measures that we need in a targeted way to support all of the different crucial elements of the economy.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, one of the most striking features of the past few weeks has been the way in which so many public, private and voluntary organisations have put themselves out of shape to deal with the pandemic, not least in my own constituency, for which a heartfelt thank you. Could I please ask the First Secretary to join with me in commending the remarkable resilience, initiative and spirit of the British people, and also perhaps to outline what he sees as the essential ingredients for getting our country through this?
First Secretary.
I think, my honourable friend, we're facing a challenge we have not faced for decades in recent memory, and it is a national effort and a team effort. So the critical ingredient is that the country comes together, as it has done, in this incredible national effort and national mission to defeat coronavirus. And like him, I pay tribute not just to the NHS workers, the carers and all those on the front line, but also to those in the voluntary sector, also to those, the people that we're understanding more and more are really also part of the key workers in our economy and our society, the delivery drivers, the people working in the supermarkets, and all of those who are steering us through this time of national crisis. Together we can rise to the challenge, and I'm absolutely confident we will rise to the challenge and come back as one United Kingdom, stronger than ever.
We're now going over to Ruth Cadbury. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For weeks, there's been a significant gap between promises from government and the reality that's been experienced by our constituents. So when will the government learn from the delays they've experienced so far, learn from other countries, and also learn from the success of the speed in which the Nightingale hospitals were delivered? When will they learn from the best in crisis decision-making and start to deliver solutions that fit the promises?
First Secretary.
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, she's absolutely right. With an unprecedented crisis, of course, we'll learn lessons. There is no country in the world addressing this crisis that doesn't. But she's also right to refer to the Nightingale hospitals, an incredible achievement in this country. People said that we couldn't build a hospital in this country at that kind of speed, and we built several with more to come. People have said that we wouldn't be able to get the 1 billion items of personal protective equipment. That's exactly what we've done. So we don't say that there are no challenges, and she's absolutely right to make the point that we need to learn the lessons as we go. But we're absolutely convinced that going along in a very deliberate way, learning the lessons, listening to the medical evidence, listening to the advice from the Chief Scientific Advisor, not just abandoning it, but following it consistently, that is how we will get through this crisis. And it's worth noting, Mr. Speaker, that one of the big risks as we go through this peak was the fear that we would find the NHS overwhelmed. It hasn't been overwhelmed. If you look at critical care capacity, if you look at the ventilators that we have managed to secure, the NHS has heroic individual achievements, but as an institution has held up well. And that is a good example of how we have risen to this challenge, and we will continue to do so.
We're now going over to Nicola Richards. Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are around 100 of my West Bromwich East constituents currently stuck in India during this pandemic, which is why I very much welcome the government's bold commitment to work with our international partners and airlines to bring back our British nationals. Could my right honourable friend provide the House with an update on the progress of this scheme?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady, and of course you'll know as Foreign Secretary I've been working flat out with the Foreign Office and our international network on that. It's worth saying that working with foreign governments and the airlines to return stranded, we've returned over 1 million British nationals on commercial flights. I think the scale of that operation, she can understand, is incredible and unprecedented. We have also introduced a special charter arrangement. We've put £75 million. We've got a whole range of international UK airlines signed up to it, and we've returned over 10,000 on charter flights. In the last few weeks, the FCO chartered 52 flights to get more than 10,000, in fact, back from 16 different countries, including nearly 5,000 from India, which I know she's mentioned. We've confirmed further flights from several countries going forward in the next few days, including India, Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Sir Edward Davey. Sir Edward.
In an answer to the Leader of the Opposition, the Foreign Secretary mentioned a consultant who died at Kingston Hospital, my local hospital. That consultant's name was Anton Sebastian Pillai. Anton came to the UK after qualifying as a doctor in Sri Lanka in 1967. Anton worked in our NHS for decades, and he was treating coronavirus patients when he caught the disease and sadly died. He was the best of us. So on behalf of Anton and the other brave NHS and care workers who made the ultimate sacrifice for others, and so we learn the lessons urgently ahead of a future pandemic, will the government commit itself now for a future independent judge-led inquiry into how this crisis has been handled?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman, and I join with him in the tribute that he made to Dr. Anton Sebastian Pillai. I know firsthand, I've been into Kingston Hospital, my boys were born there, I've been treated there, the incredible work they do, and it's my local hospital too, and so I join with him in paying tribute to what they've done. I have to say I won't take up his offer of committing to a public inquiry. I think that there are definitely lessons to be learned, and when we get through this crisis, it will be important that we take stock and we come together to understand, with an unprecedented challenge on an international scale, what can be done to avoid it happening again. But I think right now, from our key NHS frontline workers to the members of the public, they would rightly expect our full focus to be, as we come through the peak of this virus, to make sure that we save lives, protect the NHS and steer the whole country through this crisis rather than engaging in that process or that set of deliberations right now.
We now go over to Faye Jones. Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The First Secretary of State will be aware that the Army has played a vital role in the UK's response to the coronavirus, but he may not know that in Wales, the Joint Military Command was stood up in Brecon Barracks in my constituency. From there, they have been supporting local resilience forums around the country, including our 7 regional health boards. I'm extremely proud that Brecon is the home of the Army in Wales, and as the Ministry of Defence ponders the future for Brecon Barracks, will the First Secretary join me in thanking the Army for setting up the Joint Command so quickly and for working so hard?
First Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I absolutely join with her in paying tribute, as I did in relation to one of the questions in relation to Scotland, of paying tribute to the heroic effort that our armed forces are making in all 4 corners of the United Kingdom, in particular in relation to Wales. Our servicemen and women have worked tirelessly to help build the hospitals, drive the ambulances and deliver the PPE to where it needs it most. And along with the other key workers, we pay tribute, and we pay tribute to the fact that it is the UK Armed Forces in all 4 corners of the United Kingdom who are helping to deliver and get this country through the coronavirus challenge.
We go across to Liv Saville-Roberts. Liv Saville-Roberts.
Diolch, Lefarydd. If the lockdown is lifted in one nation or region because it's past the peak, we will see confusion and we will see people starting to move around, and that runs a risk of further infection. Will the First Secretary of State confirm that if the 4 nations approach is to be meaningful, the 4 governments must have an equal say, and that lifting the lockdown can only happen by the unanimous agreements of the 4 governments together?
First Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? Can I first of all pay tribute to the administration in both Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales through the COBRA meetings. We have, I think it's fair to say, had excellent cooperations between all 4 nations, and indeed with the current Mayor of London. That is critically important. If she looks at the social distancing measures, there has been a remarkable consistency in all 4 nations in terms of compliance. So I hope that we can continue to work together on a collaborative basis as we look towards the second phase. And certainly on behalf of the UK government, we are committed to doing that.
We're now going across to Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Twycross Zoo in my constituency is world renowned for the conservation work and indeed protecting endangered species. But Twycross Zoo is now endangered itself with overheads of £650,000 a month with no income coming in. They've joined together with people like Bristol Zoo and Chester Zoo and London Zoo asking for £100 million from the government to help care for the animals. Will the government commit to support good zoos? So just like the animals they protect, the zoos will be here for us all to learn from in the future.
First Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend and absolutely agree with his question. We've got to look after the zoos and all of the incredible animals that they put on display for all of us. And I'm very pleased to be able to announce that as a result of our engagement and our consultation, we can announce a new zoos support fund which will be launched and open soon. It will be able to provide dedicated support alongside that already made available by the Treasury to help zoos care for their animals during this crisis. And I urge the zoos concerned to look at the range of financial support already available, but also to make contact with DEFRA officials so we can see how it can be best tailored for them.
We now come to the final question. Angela Riedel. Angela Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Sunday, the UK and 18 countries of the G20 endorsed a comprehensive communique on COVID-19 and future global pandemic preparedness. This much-needed action plan was then effectively vetoed by the USA as a part of its unfounded attack on the World Health Organization. Given that the Prime Minister is reported to have spoken to Donald Trump yesterday, can the Right Honourable Gentleman assure this House that that Britain believes that the World Health Organization is critical to the future of global health security, and that this country will not be drawn into the US president's disgraceful vendetta against the World Health Organization.
First Secretary.
Can I reassure the Honourable Lady, first of all, that we fully support the international efforts, and indeed we are a leading player, whether it's on vaccines or supporting vulnerable countries, in helping get through what is a global crisis. In relation to the WHO, we recognise that it has a role to play. It is not perfect, no international institution is. We do need to work to reform it, but we've made clear we consider it an important part of the international response, and the UK will continue to lead the way in that effort.
Right, we're now going over to the statement. I want to tell people that we're running this for 45 minutes. The opening speeches will be for 10 minutes from the Secretary of State, 5 minutes from the Opposition, and 2 minutes for the SNP. So, in doing so, I now call the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Right Honourable Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on coronavirus. And first of all, can I say how pleased I am that the House is sitting once again. And because at this important time, it is critical that we have the scrutiny and debate provided by this House. And I'd like to thank everybody involved in setting up the new arrangements, because this has demonstrated that no virus and no threat will thwart our democracy. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus continues to spread throughout the world. The latest figures show that 17,337 people have sadly died here. Our hearts and the hearts of the whole House go out to their loved ones. I know that across the House, we are united in our determination to fight this virus with everything we've got. And today, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to update the House on each part of our battle plan. First, the resilience of the NHS. I can tell the House that for the first time, we now have over 3,000 spare critical care beds in the NHS. That is more than 3 times more than we had at the start of this crisis. It's thanks to the incredible work of an awful lot of people that we now have this extra spare capacity, even before we include the new Nightingale hospitals. Over the past 2 weeks, I've been lucky enough to attend, either in person or virtually, the opening of 4 of these new Nightingales in London and Manchester, Birmingham and Harrogate, and there are several more to come all across the UK, in Belfast and Glasgow and Cardiff, Exeter and Sunderland. These incredible efforts from dedicated staff, supported by our armed forces, mean that our NHS has not at any point been overwhelmed by coronavirus. Some said this would be impossible. And today, I want to reinforce the message that non-COVID NHS services are open for patients. The NHS is there for you if you need advice and treatment. And I want to address very clearly this message to those who might be vulnerable to heart attacks or stroke, to parents of young children, to pregnant women, and to people with concerns that they may have cancer. I want to emphasise that people with non-coronavirus symptoms must still contact their GP. If you think you need medical help, please contact your GP either online or by phone to be assessed. If you need urgent medical advice, use NHS 111 online, or if you can't get online, call 111. And of course, if it's serious or life-threatening, call 999. If you are told to go to hospital, the place you need to be is in hospital. The NHS is there for you and can provide the very best care if you need it. The second point of our battle plan is on supply and working to boost supplies of core equipment. Now, the full weight of the government is behind this effort, and again, we've brought in the armed forces to help us meet this demand. This includes ventilators, both purchasing extra stock and increasing the production of new ones. We now have record numbers of ventilators, with 10,700 available for use for patients. It includes medicines, so we can make sure everyone has access to the supplies and treatments they need. And of course, it includes personal protective equipment too. In normal times, the NHS PPE supply chain supplies 233 hospital trusts. Currently, 58,000 separate health and social care settings are being supplied with PPE. So we're creating that whole new logistics network from scratch, and we have some of the best minds in the country working on this. I'm grateful to colleagues from the NHS, Public Health England, the Crown Commercial Service, Cabinet Office, Communities Department, MOD, the Armed Forces again, devolved administrations, territorial offices, the Business Department, the Treasury, the Foreign Office, and the Department for International Trade, because they are all playing their part. And last week, I appointed Lord Dighton, who delivered the Olympics, to a new role in driving forward PPE manufacturing here. Since the start of this crisis, we have delivered over 1 billion items of PPE, and we're constantly working to improve the delivery system and buying PPE from around the world. We're also working to make more at home, and I'd like to thank the UK businesses who've generously come forward with offers to turn their production lines to part of this national effort. And I'd also like to thank members from across the House who put us in contact with businesses in their constituencies. We're actively engaged with over 1,000 companies who buy from abroad and working with 159 potential UK manufacturers. We have a rigorous system of verifying the offers that we receive, because not all offers have been credible, and it's important to focus on the biggest, most credible offers first. This work is crucial so we can get our NHS and care staff the kit they need so they can do their jobs safely and with confidence. The third part, Mr. Speaker, is to scale up testing. I've set the goal of 100,000 tests a day by the end of this month, and I'm delighted to say that the expansion of capacity is ahead of plans. Even though demand has thus far been lower than expected, we are therefore ramping up the availability of this testing and expanding who is eligible for testing to making it easier to access the tests. The tests are conducted in NHS hospitals, through our drive-through centres, mobile units and home deliveries. These tests are then sent to laboratories. We've completed the construction of 3 lighthouse labs in Milton Keynes, Glasgow and Cheshire. Each site took just 3 weeks to complete and begin testing. And as we have reached the peak, and as we bring the number of new cases down, so we will introduce contact tracing at large scale. The introduction of the new NHS app for contact tracing is also in development. And as we do this, we're working closely with some of the best digital and technological brains, renowned experts in clinical safety and digital ethics, so we can get all of this right. The more people who sign up for this new app when it goes live, the better informed our response will be, and the better we can therefore protect the NHS. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure we make the best possible use of science and research to pursue the vaccines and the treatments that are essential to defeat the virus once and for all. And here the UK is at the forefront of the global effort. We've put more money into the global efforts to search for a vaccine than any other country. And yesterday I announced over £40 million of funding for the 2 most promising UK projects at Imperial and Oxford. And the vaccine for this Oxford project will be trialled in people from tomorrow, and I'm sure that the whole House will agree this is a very promising development. And I'll repeat what I said yesterday, which is that in normal times, reaching this stage would take years, and the combination of this innovative group of people at the Jenner Institute in Oxford and the MHRA, the regulator, who deserve our special praise because they are both ensuring that the process is safe, yet is also conducted more rapidly, probably than ever before. And they deserve the support of the whole House in that work. At the same time, we'll invest in manufacturing capability, because if either of these vaccines work, then we must be able to make them available for the British people as soon as humanly possible. The fifth measure I will talk about, Mr. Speaker, in the time available, is the one where everyone can play their part: social distancing. And I just want to thank everyone from across the country for their steadfast commitment in following the rules, including in this House. It is making a difference. We are at the peak. But before we relax any social distancing rules or make changes to them, we have set out the 5 tests that have to be met. First, that the NHS can continue to cope. Second, that the operational challenges have been met. Third, that the daily death rate falls sustainably and consistently. Fourth, that the rate of infection is decreasing. And most importantly, fifth, that there is no risk of a second peak. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we're working to protect the most vulnerable through shielding. This is the 6th part of our battle plan. There have been a huge effort underway across government to contact and support those at risk. We've been boosted by the support and the help of the heroic NHS volunteer responders who signed up in their droves. Within 2 days of our call to action, an unbelievable 750,000 people put themselves forward for this initiative. So with the volunteers and with the support of the Communities Department and the NHS and local councils who've done amazing work on this, that we are shielding the most vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, these are unprecedented times for us all, and we've all seen the extraordinary impact of coronavirus in our constituencies and across the country. And even though today we are physically separated, this House is at its best when we are united in our purpose and our resolve. So I will keep working with members right across the House in this fight against this invisible killer. Because this may be akin to a war, Mr. Speaker, but it's one where the whole of humanity is on the same side. And I commend this statement to the House.
Right, we now go over to the Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Ashworth. Jonathan Ashworth.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for you for making the arrangements for us to be able to participate in these circumstances. Can I thank the Secretary of State for the advance sight of his statement, and my thoughts are with all those who have lost their lives to this horrific virus. Can we pay tribute to those NHS staff who have lost their lives? I hope when this is over we can find an appropriate way to remember those NHS staff on the front line who gave their lives for all of us. And can we also remember those social care staff who have also lost their lives? Could the Secretary of State tell us what the actual number of social care staff is who have sadly died? The First Secretary didn't have those figures at his fingertips a few moments ago. It looks like we are heading to one of the worst death rates in Europe. The government have been careful to always say we're following scientific advice. Could the Secretary of State tell us what the explanation is from the government scientists as to why our death rate seems so poor compared to, for example, Germany? Will he undertake to publish the SAGE minutes, which are not being published? And could he also undertake to publish the evidence as to why we are following a 7-day rule for isolation? And that appears to contradict the World Health Organization, who suggest a 14-day rule for isolation. As the virus develops, we can see now that although it attacks the respiratory system, it also attacks cells throughout the body with the ACE2 receptors. So this is leading to cardiovascular failure, renal failure. So in the same way that the Secretary of State convenes SAGE and other committees, will he convene the clinical societies so we can share understanding of the disease amongst clinicians and how best to treat the disease as research emerges? I'm sure he will be struck, as I am, by the high number or the high proportion of deaths amongst Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. We see this in the United States as well. He has launched an inquiry. Can he update us on that inquiry and when it will report? I'm sure he is as horrified as I am at the deaths in care homes and nursing homes. This was always a high-risk sector, and which is why we were long calling for a social care strategy. Can he undertake to do 4 things? Can he ensure that all deaths are recorded on a daily basis? CQC today has suggested that the death rate in care homes is double what was reported by the ONS yesterday. Can he ensure testing for staff is delivered at care homes at local NHS sites or by mobile units? It's clearly ludicrous to expect care workers to travel miles and miles and miles to drive through testing centres. Can he ensure that PPE supply systems for the NHS is now expanded to the social care sector as well? I know he's made some announcements today, perhaps he could give us more details. And he said in the past the NHS will get whatever it takes. Can the social care now get funding to cover the huge costs they are facing associated with increased staffing and PPE? Now, I join him in praising the leadership of the NHS for what they had done, and he gave us the critical care figures. Can he tell us how many general and acute beds are currently empty in the NHS? And if there are significant numbers empty, could they be used for residents from social care, or could they be used to start returning to doing elective surgery, for example? Because we know this lockdown is having an impact on wider health health problems. Cancer patients are going without treatment. We know that the elective waiting list will rise. Could he tell us the latest estimates of what he thinks it will rise to? And of course, there is bound to be mental health problems as well associated with the lockdown. On PPE, many people are understandably angry that frontline staff don't seem to be getting the PPE on time, and that we do not seem to have taken part in some of the European procurement projects. The Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster said it was because we missed an email. He said we are now part of it, but that begs the question, why were we not part of it at the beginning? And of course, the senior civil servant at the Foreign Office said it was a political decision. Could he just tell us exactly what went on and when? Perhaps could he publish all the background briefings so we can see exactly what happened, and he can reassure us that everything was done appropriately. And finally, on testing, I agree with him. Testing and contact tracing is vital to coming out of a lockdown. So he talks about wanting to upscale contact tracing. That is very labour intensive. Can we use the 750,000 volunteers who have signed up to do some of that contact tracing? The app that he talks about is welcome. When will it be available? Is he proposing that app will be mandatory, or will it be a voluntary app? And if it's a voluntary app, how will we ensure that it is taken up by the population? And on testing, can he just comment on the reports today that one of the PCR test, which has been used for some NHS staff, returned false results, and those staff have had to be tested again. How many have been affected by this, and what is now in place to ensure that doesn't happen again as well? If you cannot answer all these points today, I hope perhaps you can write to me with the details later today.
Secretary of State. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for the approach that he's taken, bringing scrutiny, but done so in a tone that makes clear that right across this House we're united in our efforts to tackle this virus. He asked specifically the number of social care staff who sadly died. The number is that 15 social care staff have sadly lost their lives. And in the same way that we pay tribute to and we remember all those NHS staff who've died, so too we do for those who serve our country and look after people in social care. He asked about the question about the relative, the international comparisons on the number of deaths. Of course, this needs to be done scientifically, taking into account the size of the populations of different countries. And it is, there is an important analysis that we're constantly doing of why the death rate as a proportion of the population in Germany is lower. It's something I speak to my German counterpart about. In the same way that we look at all the European countries where the death rate is higher, and we try to learn also lessons to make sure that we are doing the best that we possibly can here. There are many explanations for Germany, and one of them that the German health minister explains both in public and in private is the nature of those who first caught the disease in Germany. But there is analysis. There's an awful lot of analysis of why, and we're constantly looking at this question to improve our delivery here. He asked about the 7-day rule and the proposals through SAGE. SAGE, of course, is an advisory committee, and it advises ministers. We are guided by the science throughout this, and the science recommends the 7-day rule on returning to, it's not returning to normal by any stretch, but coming out of full-blown isolation once somebody has had the disease, if they no longer have symptoms. That is the scientific advice, and the basis on which that decision was taken was precisely as he says, that we listened to the advice from SAGE, and then we we take decisions based on it. And that was one that was where we fully accepted the advice, as we do most of these clinical type decisions. He asked about expanding clinical understanding, because he's right that the primary and the biggest impact of this is on the this disease is on the respiratory system. It's not the only impact, I will seek to take up his suggestion that the key clinical figures are convened. I think that the Royal Colleges are doing this already, but I'll check that is happening. Similarly, he asked the question about the disproportionate number of people from minority ethnic backgrounds in the figures of those who've died. We are indeed investigating that, and I will make sure that he has a copy of the results of that investigation as soon as it is concluded. It's a very important piece of work. In the same way that there's a disproportionate number of men who are badly affected by this disease compared to women, we need to look at all of these characteristics and make sure we have the full analysis so we can learn how to treat. He asked about care homes. All deaths in care homes, of course, are recorded. The figures are the difference in the figures between the figures produced by the CQC, the Office for National Statistics, and the NHS for deaths in hospitals. Those figures measure slightly different things at different time frames. It's very important to look at a rigorous analysis of the comparison of the three. Yesterday there was some debate about whether the ONS figures showed that the deaths, when you measure deaths outside of hospitals, were 40% higher. It turned out that wasn't true. It was comparing apples and pears, and the real figure is closer to 20%. So I would just caution him against comparing the headline figures without a true comparison of the underlying statistics. He asked about the testing of staff. I'm really pleased that we've managed to roll out the testing to staff in care homes. He's absolutely right that can helpfully be done through mobile units and through the home testing kits that are increasingly available, especially for care homes that aren't close to one of the drive-through centres. Although now we have 27 drive-through centres, we're increasing that number over the next few days. There's new drive-through centres coming on stream all of the time. He also asked about PPE supplies to care, quite rightly, and there is a new service that is coming on stream directly to be able to provide the PPE that care homes and domiciliary care, so care provided in people's homes, that needs. As I say, increasing this supply has been a massive logistical undertaking, with over 1 billion items of PPE delivered so far. The couple of other questions that he asked. He asked about the amount of spare capacity in the NHS. There are over 10,000 beds currently free in the NHS. And we want to reopen the NHS to non-coronavirus symptoms and to patients with non-coronavirus conditions safely and carefully as soon as it's safe to do so. But the first step that we're taking is to send the message loud and clear to people who have suspected conditions that they should come forward. If you think you might have a lump that might be a cancer, then you should come forward now, and you will be safely and properly treated in the NHS. The same goes if you have a suspected heart attack or stroke. We have the systems in place to make sure that if you come to the NHS, you will be looked after and protected. And we will gradually reopen the rest of the NHS, for instance, to the sort of non-life-threatening elective surgery that the Honourable Member mentioned, as soon as it's safe to do so. But as he can see, the combination of having some spare capacity in the NHS and at the same time of having reached the peak of the virus means that we can now start to reopen the NHS. And part of that is encouraging people to seek NHS treatment when they need it. Finally, Mr. Speaker, he mentioned contact tracing and the app. The app is currently in beta trials, and those trials are going well. But clearly, an app to tell you who you've been in contact with if you test positive for coronavirus is helpful, but what we also need is mass contact tracing, so that as we bring the rate of transmission down and the rate of testing up, so that everybody who gets tested positive, we can contact all of the people they've been in contact with, make sure they get access to support and they know what to do, and that way we can control this virus with fewer of the very extraordinary social distancing measures that have been in place.
I just hope we can speed a little bit more on the answer. I know you want to make sure they're thorough, but we have got quite a few to get through. I think it's twice as long as the question. That was the problem. Right. Can I now go to the chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt? Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The World Health Organization say that one of the 6 essential criteria for lifting a lockdown is that we should be able to track and trace every single new COVID case in the community. Can I ask the Health Secretary, will that be in place in the next 2 weeks, so that when the Cabinet come to consider whether they want to lift the lockdown, they are able to do so in a way that's compliant with what the WHO are recommending? And will he appoint a big hitter from outside frontline politics to really make sure that this happens in a very short period of time, as he has very sensibly done with Sir Paul Dighton on PPE?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. The answer is that we are ramping up our testing capacity and our capacity for contact tracing in a matter of weeks, and we'll have it ready to make sure that we can use that as and when the incidence of transmission comes down. It isn't as tied to the specific decision that we're required by law to take it just over 2 weeks' time. It is the effectiveness of test, track and trace to keep the reproductive rate of this virus down is determined by the incidence in the community, and our goal is to get to a point where we can test, track and trace everybody who needs it.
We're now going across to Philippa Whitford. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Like all MPs, I would like to pay tribute to health and care staff across the UK, but particularly in view of the key role of care workers, will the Secretary of State undertake to ensure they are paid at least the real living wage in recognition of their contribution, as has been the case for some years in Scotland? Like everyone, I welcome the stabilisation of COVID cases, but does he accept that the testing and contact tracing must actually be in place before any easing of the lockdown to avoid resurgence and a second peak? So will he achieve 100,000 tests a day by next week? If not, when? And how accurate are the tests in light of the report of a 25% false negative rate? Now, I know the Secretary of State is a fan of phone apps, so I'm glad to hear him recognise the need to increase public health staff to both conduct and coordinate contact tracing. So will he reverse the 20% cut in public health funding in England since 2015 to ensure that they can be recruited now? Finally, when I raised the issue of asymptomatic spread on the 11th of March, he claimed it was rare, but it's actually about 50%. So how is he taking that into account in his COVID strategy?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady asked a number of questions. Firstly, on the living wage, absolutely all health and social care staff in the UK are paid the living wage because that is the law. I'm very proud that we introduced the living wage, and that has led to a significant rise in the pay of, especially of people in social care who were on the minimum wage previously. She asks about asymptomatic transmission. The evidence, the scientific evidence on asymptomatic transmission does show that asymptomatic transmission occurs. That is one of the very significant challenges that this virus presents. She also asked about test, track and trace. I absolutely agree that test, track and trace is a critical part of keeping the spread of this virus low. It is more effective the lower the incidence, the lower the number of new cases are, the more effective test, track and trace is. And we are therefore building now the capacity for that very large-scale contact tracing that is necessary to go alongside the large-scale testing, the 100,000, as I said in my statement at the end of this month, and also the technology that can help us to do that.
We now go over to Greg Clark. Greg Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that decisions should be informed by good advice. So has the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, SAGE, advised on whether the 100,000 tests a day target is the right one?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. The target set at 100,000 was because that is what we estimated was needed. There was scientific advice provided into that target, but also what is practically achievable. As I said, we are ahead of our trajectory on capacity, but we need to make sure that demand increases. That is the increasing demand is about widening access to this testing. We did take scientific advice. I'm not sure whether that came directly through the SAGE route or directly from Public Health England, but of course these decisions are based on the science.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to just pay tribute very briefly to all those health workers, care workers, delivery workers, street cleaners, and so many other groups all over the country that are doing such an incredible job together with all the volunteers to deal with this crisis. I think it's an amazing moment in this country's history. However, Parliament's job is to hold the government to account, and the question I want to ask is quite simply this. The World Health Organization indicated that there was a danger of an epidemic from corona in January. They later declared it to be a pandemic. The Director General of the World Health Organization said in terms, the way of dealing with it is test, 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 in order to ascertain the levels of infection across our society. We didn't do that. The Secretary of State came to the House in January to say he was going to increase the amount of testing. It was raised with the Prime Minister on the 24th of February. It was raised again with the Prime Minister at a meeting we had, which he was present at in March. And he told us then the level of testing would increase. It's still nowhere near the level that is necessary. Can he assure us that there's going to be a really rapid increase in the level of testing and the availability of testing to get on top of this dreadful virus?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The development of testing has been at pace throughout this crisis, entirely contrary to the story told by the Right Honourable Gentleman. We were one of the first countries in the world to develop a test. We rapidly increased the number of tests to 2,000 at the start of March to 10,000. That's a multiple of 5 times during March, and now going up further. This is an area where we've had our foot on the gas all the way through because it is incredibly important.
James Davies. James Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement. Would he kindly update the House on the provision of a new COVID testing site in North Wales and the UK government's role in delivering this in the context of devolution?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, testing is an area where there are UK and devolved responsibilities, and in the testing sites, the drive-throughs, they are being provided right across the UK. It's a programme that's driven by the government here with the support of the devolved authorities. I think making sure that there's testing available in North Wales is incredibly important. And as it is right across the country, especially so that people can get access to those tests as he has said. I'd also mention the home testing, which will be done through the post, which of course will also be available, especially in more rural areas that, like his constituency, that might be one of the most effective ways for people to be able to get access to testing.
We're going across to Hilary Benn. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It seems increasingly likely that part of what will be required to tackle this virus in future will be the wearing of masks by members of the public in certain situations. If the government comes to the point, based on the scientific advice, that that is recommended, is the government's policy to provide masks to the public? And if so, what is his plan to source them, given the difficulties we have seen with PPE supply? Or will members of the public be expected to source their own?
Secretary of State.
We'll follow the advice. We'll listen to what the SAGE advisory group says on masks, and then we will implement that. I can't promise that we will give everybody free masks. I mean, that would be an extraordinary undertaking, and we do have to make sure that we have supplies available, especially for health and care staff, where the scientific advice throughout has been that the wearing of masks is necessary in those circumstances, and we've got to make sure the provision is there for them.
Going over to Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I start by paying tribute to the excellent staff at Epsom Hospital for the work they're doing in tackling this dreadful disease? Could I say to the Secretary of State that I absolutely agree with him that it should be business as close as usual as possible across the NHS. But of course, there are many people who work in our healthcare arena, dentists, physiotherapists and others, for whom it's very much not business as usual. Can he do everything he can, together with other ministers, to support those people, and particularly to get them back working as soon as possible?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, absolutely. It's incredibly important that we support NHS staff to get back to work as much as possible if they have been in an area where the demand has fallen. And because people have been not coming forward in the same numbers that they normally do for instance, for emergency admission, or they've been in a specialism where we haven't been able to undertake the work because of the prevalence of the virus. He makes an incredibly important point, and I can give him that assurance.
We now go over to Lucy Powell.
Thank you.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you. At present, only patients actually admitted to hospital with symptoms are being swabbed, leaving many with presumed COVID being discharged into the community. At the same time, only healthcare workers with current symptoms are being offered tests. Shouldn't the main priority now be to test all patients and all health and social care workers, whether symptomatic or not, given that after a month of lockdown, hospitals and care homes are likely to be the major transmission hotspots?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are testing all those who leave hospital to go to a care home setting to make sure that we control the spread of the disease and stop it moving from that route as much as is possible. But on the broader points of expansion, absolutely these are things that we're looking at. She makes good points.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is right in making sure that all patients being discharged from hospital to care homes are being tested. But there remains concern in the care home sector that normal procedures of assessment to make sure that patients coming to them or new residents are appropriate for the care setting. And because of emergency admission, this isn't always taking place. Before Easter, he very kindly agreed to look at the question of whether care homes could be indemnified or have some kind of waiver of liability in these circumstances. I wonder whether he had reached a conclusion.
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we are looking into that question, and I'll write to my right honourable friend as soon as we have an answer.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On contract tracing, I welcome the fact that he's working with experts in digital ethics, because if it's not run transparently by a public company with code open to public oversight and data anonymised, then people won't trust the system and it risks failing. But does he agree that only a community-led process of human contact tracing can provide the fine-grained and reliable data that such an app would depend on? And will he learn the lesson from the over-centralised organisation of the testing approach and instead adopt a more decentralised approach for contact tracing using local environmental health officers and PHE's regional outbreak management teams?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agreed with the first 2 points, which is the importance of people for contact tracing as well as technology. And in fact, the two working hand in hand will be the most effective approach. I also agree with the need for the ethicists around this. We are giving up a huge amount of our liberty, all of us, because of social distancing. And so measures to reduce social distancing, for instance, through the use of data, need to be considered in that context. But we are making sure that that's done in a way that can provide assurance to people with concerns in that area. On the final point, we've got to make the appropriate use both of national and of local resources. In testing, for instance, organising drive-through centres across the country and home testing is inevitably an issue that needs to be done centrally, and then other testing laboratories are organised locally. It's about getting the best of both worlds.
Going across to Laura Trott. Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has talked today about the test, track and trace strategy, and he's indicated that the effectiveness is determined by the incidence in the community. Can he give us guidance on what this incidence level is and when, based on current modelling, we might achieve it?
Well, the current level of incidence is unknown until we expand testing yet further, but it is far, far higher than where it needs to be. Although, as I said, we are at a peak, and we have high confidence that we are at a peak in this disease. But obviously, we need to see that come down. And it's a question of degree. The reason I'm not giving a numerical answer is because it is a question of degree. The fewer new cases, the more effective test, track and trace are as a way of keeping the disease down, and therefore the more of the social distancing measures can be lifted. This is all a question of degree, and we do not have an answer to the question of when that will all be doable, because we have not yet seen the curve start to come down, and we don't know the pace at which that curve will come down under the current social distancing rules.
Going across to Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I just say to the Secretary of State, who I've known ever since he came into Parliament, I know he's been unwell, but he would expect me to be robust in my question. And can I tell him that as a Member of Parliament for Huddersfield, looking from the Yorkshire point of view, I think the management and leadership of this present crisis has been shambolic. I believe that we should never have been in the position where we lag so far behind Germany, a similar country to ours, and behind many of the other European nations we're predicted to be the worst. 823 people died. That's 2 jumbo jets of crashes. That's a large number. And the fact of the matter is, every time the Secretary of State speaks, he thinks it's a triumph what he's doing. I believe that it is a shambles of leadership and management. I think we're letting down NHS staff, and they have been let down. And indeed, I'm particularly cross and particularly angry at the fact that I understand that those early whistleblowers were so lent on and threatened with disciplinary action that was to stop brave young doctors and nurses standing up and telling it what it was like on the front line. Is that the fact? And can he get his act together? Because many of us do not believe that he's telling the truth to the people of this country.
Of State.
We want to be united.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the member who just spoke completely misses the tone and has missed the point of what we're trying to do as a nation to pull together in this time of grave difficulty. It is absolutely the case that our prime goals at the start of this crisis, to flatten the curve and to make sure that the NHS always has the capacity to treat everybody who needs it, those two objectives have thus far been met. Of course there are challenges. There are enormous challenges. Distributing 1 billion pieces of PPE is not straightforward. On the point he makes about whistleblowers, he is completely wrong to say that it is not possible to raise an issue within the NHS. By contrast, thousands of people do it in public and in private every single day. So it saddens me that a member of this House might get the tone wrong so badly. There are reasonable questions to be asked, and we try to answer them in a reasonable way, and I think that's the best way for this House to proceed.
We're going across to Sigurri Streeter. Sigurri!
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I put on record my personal thanks to the Secretary of State for his quite remarkable personal efforts over the last few weeks. I think he's doing a terrific job in unprecedented circumstances. Can I welcome what he said about non-COVID-19 treatment earlier this afternoon? Will he, as soon as possible, please set out a clear plan to enable elective surgery to take place once again in hospitals that do have capacity, so we don't build up a nasty backlog of unmet health needs? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Yes, this is an incredibly important issue. We want to get the non-COVID-19 treatment back up and running as quickly, as safely possible, and of course putting in place the arrangements to make sure that when people do go into hospital without COVID-19, then they aren't infected by people who are in hospital with COVID-19. That segregation is a very important part of our considerations. The answer is yes, within very short order, we will start to restart the NHS. He talks about elective operations. That's an important part, but so too is people presenting themselves and giving people the confidence to call their GP, or if it's urgent, call 111 if they have a problem. Because we know, for instance, in cancer that early diagnosis is critical, and I want people who think that they've got a risk to come forward for that treatment.
Going across to Rosie Cooper in Lancashire. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a statement today and at the Health Select Committee, the Secretary of State has implored cancer patients to come forward and assured them of treatment. Yet since the Health Select Committee, I've been inundated with messages from all over the country from desperate patients whose treatment has been stopped, interrupted, or not even started because of COVID-19. So I would like to ask the Secretary of State what he's doing to ensure that there isn't a gap between his welcome words and what's actually happening. Can he guarantee that treatment will go ahead and give patients confidence that we've got COVID-free hospitals by frequent and widespread testing of staff? And finally, that ensuring death in service benefits will be paid to all healthcare workers who've died of COVID-19, both now and retrospectively.
Secretary of State.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to be absolutely clear, as I was at the Health Select Committee, which I thought was a very good discussion, about this point about cancer treatment. There is some cancer treatment that it is clinically inadvisable to undertake during an epidemic like this, because if you take somebody's immune system down to very low levels, then that puts them at significant risk. So I can't give the guarantee that all cancer treatment would go ahead, because even though we have capacity now in the NHS, and we have confidence that that capacity will not be overcapped by the virus is still at large in the community. So there are some cancer treatments that it is clinically inadvisable to undertake now, especially around immunotherapy. Having said that, yes, we do want people to come forward, and we do want to have as much cancer treatment as possible going ahead, that where it is safe to do so, considering the impact of the virus. And that's why I do want people to come forward if they have a risk, and then we will treat them as best as we possibly can within the constraints of the fact that we have a very serious virus stalking the land.
Going across to Luke Evans.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Frontline workers in things like ITU and care homes are used to death. That's part of the job, but not on this scale and not in these circumstances. What is he and his department doing to support the mental health of frontline workers both now and in the future when the pandemic passes?
Secretary of State.
This is an incredibly important question. We've put in place a helpline for all frontline workers in the NHS to make sure that they have the support that they need, and I will make sure, working with the Honourable Member and others, I'll make sure that that support stays in place long after this crisis is over.
We're going across to Patrick Grady. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will he join me in welcoming the extraordinary effort by all those involved in getting NHS Louisa Jordan in Glasgow ready to receive patients if needed? Can he outline what discussions he's had with the Scottish Government counterpart about the different operating model between NHS Louisa Jordan and NHS Nightingale in London? And can he outline what steps he's taking to address the long-term nursing shortages in England, especially flight of nurses from the European Union, that reports suggest are impacting on the operation of NHS Nightingale?
Restate.
I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Speaker. I don't recognise those reports at all. There is no impact at all of Brexit on our coronavirus response. And the good news is that we've had thousands of nurses and other clinicians come back into service since this crisis started.
Across to Kevin Hollinray. Kevin Hollinray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Daniel Falouche, who's a professor of infectious diseases based in Shanghai, points to the fact that part of China's very successful efforts to control the virus was immediate quarantining, in that people go to a clinic, they're immediately tested, they wait for the results, it's a 15-minute test, and if that test is positive, they're quarantined there and then. Would the Health Secretary consider this as a potential for a very significant mitigation as we open up our economy against the chances of a second wave of this virus?
Secretary of State.
Well, of course, we look at all options. What I would say is that under the test, track and trace strand, of course, the policy advice on how people should isolate if they test positive is an important part of that. We have that advice currently in place, but of course test, track and trace really does rely also on self-isolation to make sure that it's implemented properly. Test, track and trace is about finding out who needs to take action, and then they do need to take the action that is currently set out.
We now come to the final question. Maria Riedel.
Speaker. On the 11th of March, I asked the Secretary of State whether it was right to allow over 3,000 Atletico Madrid fans to travel to Anfield to watch a Champions League game when they couldn't have watched their team in Madrid because attending football matches there was banned because it was a COVID hotspot. The Liverpool City region now has a higher than average incidence of COVID-19 than the UK and English average. The Mayor of Madrid, the Director of Public Health for the City of Liverpool, have both said it was a mistake to let the match go ahead, and the government's Deputy Chief Medical Scientific Advisor has said the idea that there's a link is an interesting hypothesis. Does he now admit that the government was behind the curve in banning such gatherings, and will he undertake to investigate any possible link between that match and the higher incidence of COVID in Liverpool?
Secretary of State.
Well, this is, of course, a question for the scientists, and what matters now is making sure that whether people are in Liverpool, across the northwest, that people get the treatment that they need and that we get the curve under control.
Order. That concludes scrutiny proceedings for today. Before suspending the House, I wish to place on record my thanks, and I believe the thanks of the whole House, for the commitment, the ingenuity of all those who have made today's proceedings possible. I can say almost everything has gone smoothly, but we will learn lessons as we do this more. Firstly, following remarks made yesterday in the debate on hybrid proceedings, I wish to explain how I will deal with points of order from Monday. Members must give notice of a point of order to my office before the start of sitting. If I am satisfied that the matter to be raised is a genuine point of order, the members will will not be called to raise it. Instead, I will make a statement at the conclusion of scrutiny proceedings, setting out the point of order the member who has raised it and my ruling on it. I will now suspend the House for 15 minutes to allow members to safely leave the chamber and for broadcasting colleagues to make the necessary technical changes to our physical-only proceedings, and thank all who have taken part. Order! Order!